Greetings and welcome back to Protecting Veil and Ancient Christian Wisdom. I had not expected to find ourselves so far afield from where we started. If you're only now joining us, we began with theological reflections on themes in Paul Kingsnorth's new book, Against the Machine, on the Unmaking of Humanity. But here we are. I hope we will manage to continue to see the forest for the trees. We will make it back to Kingsnorth's book, I promise. I, for one, am very much enjoying this detour as we dig more deeply into one of the unseen forces that most affect us in the modern world, our economic system. If you're interested in joining my chronological book study of Kingsnorth's book, you can do so Thursday evenings at 7:30. If you'd like to join the Thematic study, that happens on Monday evenings at 7:30. On the Protecting Veil channel. Hi there, quick ad for the You Are Not a Machine Gadfly Academy merch store, which is now open. You can find the link in the show notes. We have t-shirts like this one, etc. So if you are looking for Christmas gifts for the tech skeptic in your life, the merch store is the place to go. And if you want to support this work too, take care. Enjoy the rest of the video. So as long as we continue our discussion of capitalism, I'm going to repeat the following quote from Against the Machine as a good way of getting properly oriented. It's my attempt, at least, to continue to keep a connection to Kingsnorth's book, which is where we was our jumping off spot. So here's the quote. "The values of that machine are now so ubiquitous that we treat them as if they were as natural as rain or wind. Progress, openness, an objection to limits and borders, therapeutic individualism, universalism, the rejection of roots, place, and history, pure materialism, the triumph of reason over superstition, scientism, commercialism, and the primacy of market values. All of these go to make up the unseen and unquestioned value system within which we live, and to which we feel there is simply no alternative." That's from page 42. So, as I mentioned previously, we are considering capitalism because it is important for Orthodox Christians to understand the world in which we find ourselves and the forces and influence that this world has upon us. In this installment in particular, we are beginning to consider the role that Protestant theology played in the development of capitalism. As I note before, there is a little bit of a debate about this topic, so I do want to mention that. But I think in broad strokes, it is helpful to look at this in these terms and in this historical context. Some of the ideas that we will discuss, Luther's idea of calling, Calvin's understanding of predestination, and so on, are antithetical to Orthodox Christian teaching and need to be rejected outright. Unfortunately, because these ideas are baked into our economic system, they continue to exert an influence on us, on our children, and on society more generally. As noted in our last installment, the first great impetus and justification for capitalism can be found in the age of exploration, as the first great race for global dominance unfolded. The next great impetus for the spread of capitalism can be found in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Prior to the Reformation, the medieval Christian world had been wary of excessive profits. It regulated interest via usury laws. It emphasized almsgiving and communal charity, regarded the accumulation of wealth as spiritually dangerous, and framed work mainly in terms of one's social and religious station. Max Weber, in his famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1905, argued that Protestantism provided the cultural and psychological foundation for the justification and growth of capitalism. Weber identifies a variety of factors, chief among which include 1. The vocational revolution, 2. The demystification of the world, 3. The focus on individual responsibility, 4. The anxiety caused by predestination, 5. The idea of asceticism within the world, 6, the weakening of traditional communal restraints, as well as 7, the fostering of habits of reinvestment and disciplined accumulation rather than consumption. So in today's installment, we're going to look at one of these ideas in particular. We'll consider the other ideas mentioned above in future installments. So today we're going to look at the vocational revolution occasioned by the Protestant Revolution, and in particular, the theology of Martin Luther. To do so, we'll quote extensively from Max Weber. So here is a quote from his book. But at least one thing was unquestionably new, that is, in Martin Luther's conception of the calling vocation of the Christian. And that thing was the valuation of the fulfillment of duty in worldly affairs as the highest form which the moral activity of the individual could assume. This it was which inevitably gave everyday worldly activity a religious significance, and which first created the conception of a calling. In this sense, the conception of the calling thus brings out that central dogma of all Protestant denominations, which the Catholic division of ethical precepts into procepta, that is, precepts, moral commandments required of all Christians, and consilia, that is, voluntary forms of holiness not required, such as poverty, chastity, and obedience in particular. So these things get discarded. The only way of living acceptably to God was not to surpass worldly morality in monastic asceticism, according to Luther, but solely through the fulfillment of the obligations imposed upon the individual by his position in the world. That was his calling. That's from page 40 of Routledge's publication of Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. So prior to the Protestant Reformation, one's work in the world had essentially a neutral value. Though one might be encouraged to do one's work well, there was no sense that the work itself was somehow holy and that it was somehow the purpose of one's human life. On the surface, this might not appear to be an important shift, but the trajectory of the past 500 years makes it clear what happens when work itself is regarded as one's path to God. Work gets elevated, deified, and once God has been killed, quote unquote, we end up with a culture that searches in vain for its purpose, fulfillment, and reward in work. As Orthodox Christians, it's important to remember that our purpose, fulfillment, and reward are found in Christ and in fulfilling his commandments, wherever he may take us. In a culture in which work is deified in this way, it can be tempting to pursue one's career with the vigor and attention that are only appropriate for the pursuit of God. Similarly, for those of us who have the responsibility of raising children in the modern world, our chief concern must be the nurturing of love for Christ and the fulfilling of the commandments, with vocational concerns a distant second. In case Weber's case was not clear from the above, here it can be seen developed further. Initially, as an Augustinian monk, here's a quote, another quote from his book. So initially, as an Augustinian monk, quite in harmony with the prevailing tradition of the Middle Ages, as represented, for example, by Thomas Aquinas, he, that is Martin Luther, thought of activity in the world as a thing of the flesh, even though willed by God. It is the indispensable natural condition of a life of faith. But in itself, like eating and drinking, it's morally neutral. But with the development of the conception of sola fide, that is, faith alone in salvation, in all its consequences and its logical result, the increasingly sharp emphasis against the Catholic consilia evangelica, that is, poverty, chastity, and obedience, of the monks, as dictates of the devil, that was what how Luther referred to them. The calling, Luther's idea of calling, grew in importance. The monastic life is not only quite devoid of value as a means of justification before God, but he also looks upon its renunciation of the duties of this world as the product of selfishness, withdrawing from temporal obligations. In contrast, labor in a calling appears to him as the outward expression of brotherly love. This he proves by the observation that the division of labor forces every individual to work for others. But his viewpoint is highly naive, forming an almost grotesque contrast to Adam Smith's well-known statements on the same subject. And here's my aside. So Adam Smith made it clear that the division of labor was not a moral, but a utilitarian reality, which is what makes Luther's idea grotesque. So back to Weber. However, this justification, which is evidently essentially scholastic, soon disappears again, and there remains more and more strongly emphasized the statement that the fulfillment of worldly duties is under all circumstances the only way to live acceptably to God. It and it alone is the will of God, and hence every legitimate calling has exactly the same worth in the sight of God. That this moral justification of worldly activity was one of the most important results of the Reformation, especially of Luther's part in it, is beyond doubt, and may even be considered a platitude. And that is from page 41. So again, having the perspective of over 500 years of capitalism, it has become clear that this new understanding of calling, as understood by Luther and the Puritan theologians that followed him, led to the deification of basic capitalist orthodoxies, in this case, the division of labor. While they might not have used the term division of labor, their theology of vocation laid the moral and cultural foundation that made a specialized, organized society more acceptable and even spiritually meaningful. The results have been predictably disastrous. Luther jettisoned 1,500 years of the Church's wisdom. That is, that the ascetic struggle is foundational and is finally the beating heart of traditional Christian spiritual life, for all Christians, monastic or otherwise. In its place, Luther, making, quote, the observation that the division of labor forces every individual to work for others, end quote, laid the foundation for the replacement of actual spiritual life with the most worldly of pursuits, the deification of work in a quote-unquote spiritual justification for the accumulation of wealth. Again, I should mention that Weber's interpretations of Luther and later Puritan theologians are matters for debate. In a sense, the origin of the deification of work is less important than the reality in which we find ourselves in a capitalist world that does deify work, efficiency, productivity, and so on. These are influences that definitely affect one's spiritual life, and as such are worthy of consideration and concern. So that is it for today. In the next installment, we will continue our consideration of the history and consequences of capitalism, and in particular of its theological roots in the Protestant Reformation. If you haven't already read Paul's book, I encourage you to do so. And again, please join us for our weekly book study, 7:30 on most Mondays and Thursdays. Finally, for a very limited time, you can purchase Gadfly Academy and You Are Not a Machine merch in time for Christmas. We have t-shirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, hats, and more. Great gifts for the tech skeptics in your life and a great way to start conversations with family and friends. So that is it for today. Thanks, as always, for being a subscriber. If you haven't already downloaded our ebook on ancient Christian wisdom, please do so now. There's a link in the show notes, and I will see you again soon. Take care.